The envelope was the color of old teeth. Patricia Hensley Kim found it on the morning of June 14th, 2017, tucked inside a cedar chest that had traveled with her family through 4 generations and 3 states, surviving 2 house fires, a flood in 1962, and the slow attrition of time that destroys most things people mean to keep. The chest itself smelled of cedar and something older, something that belonged to places before air conditioning, before sealed windows, before the particular silence of climate-controlled rooms. It smelled of coal. Not the sharp chemical smell of modern coal processing, but the deeper, earthier smell of a mountain opened and emptied. The smell of stone that had been pressed by geological time into something that burned. She almost didn't open it that morning. She was 53 years old, a retired school librarian from Charlottesville, and she had driven to her mother's house in Norton, Virginia, to help clear out the basement after her mother's passing the previous March. The cedar chest was one of dozens of items she was cataloging, sorting into keep, donate, and discard piles, the blunt and exhausting arithmetic of grief. The chest itself would go to her daughter. The contents were mostly what she expected: an embroidered tablecloth that had yellowed past saving, a collection of postcards from the 1940s, 3 hymnals, and a small bundle of letters tied with cotton string that had gone nearly translucent with age. And then, beneath the letters, the envelope. It was standard manila, or had been once. The color had deepened through a century into something closer to amber. It was sealed with red wax, pressed with a design she couldn't immediately identify, something circular with what might have been initials at the center. Written across the front in a hand that was careful and deliberate, not hurried, not careless, but the handwriting of someone who had chosen each letter, were the words, "This document is the private confession of Dr. William Abner Hensley, M.D., of Norton, Virginia, and is to be opened not less than 100 years after the date of my death, which occurred on March 3rd, 1917. I charge whoever finds this with the solemn obligation to read it entirely before judging its author, and with the further obligation to ensure that it reaches those with the power to name what has been left unnamed." Patricia sat down on the basement floor. She was not a woman given to dramatics. She had spent 30 years teaching children to find their way through books, had raised 2 daughters largely alone after her divorce, had buried her father and her mother and one of her oldest friends to cancer, and had developed, over those decades, the particular composure of someone who has learned that the world will continue to require things of you, regardless of how you feel. But she sat on that basement floor for a long time, holding the envelope before she did anything else. She did not open it immediately. Some instinct told her that whatever was inside had waited 100 years and could wait another day. She placed it on the kitchen table, made herself a cup of coffee, called her daughter in Richmond, and told her she had found something strange. Then she called a historian she knew slightly, from a conference on Appalachian history she had attended 3 years earlier, a man named Dr. James Tackett at the University of Virginia's College at Wise, who had written a book about labor history in the Southwest Virginia coalfields. She left him a voicemail. Then she went back to the kitchen table and looked at the envelope for another hour. She opened it the next morning. The first page was a single sheet, written in the same careful hand as the outside, and it began with words that she would later describe as sounding in her head like a man sitting down heavily in a chair. I write this not to be forgiven, but to be understood. There are things a company doctor does in coal country that no medical school teaches. I have spent 3 years now attempting to compose this account in a way that is honest about what I did and why, and I have concluded that the only honest way is to begin at the beginning and to continue to the end without the mercy of omission. I have omitted things for long enough. The men whose names I list in these pages deserve at least that. The end of my omissions. She turned the page. William Abner Hensley arrived in Norton, Virginia in the autumn of 1907, and he was 26 years old, and he believed, with the particular confidence of a young man who had just completed a medical degree from the University of Virginia, on a combination of family sacrifice and borrowed money, that medicine was a science and a calling simultaneously, that it was possible to do both good and precise work in the world. He had grown up in Roanoke, the son of a hardware merchant who had died of a heart attack when William was 17, and the family had been reduced in circumstances in the years after. He had gotten through university by tutoring and by the generosity of a maternal uncle who believed in him. He had graduated in the class of 1906, had done a year of general practice in Roanoke, and had then answered an advertisement placed by the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company in the Virginia Medical Journal, seeking a company physician for their operations in Wise County. The advertisement offered a salary that was nearly 3 times what a young general practitioner could expect in a city practice, plus housing, a company horse, and later a Ford automobile, and the intriguing phrase, unparalleled opportunities for clinical observation. He had written to his uncle about the position, and his uncle had written back, William, the coal companies are not charitable organizations. They are offering that salary because no established doctor will take the work. I hope you know what you're doing. He did not. But he went anyway. Norton in 1907 was a town in the process of becoming something. The railroad had arrived 15 years earlier, and the coal boom had followed it like a tide, and now the streets were half mud and half something aspiring to be more than mud. There were boarding houses and churches and a dry goods store and 2 rival newspapers and a courthouse, and increasingly, the infrastructure of an economy organized around a single extractable fact, that the mountains surrounding Norton contained coal seams of exceptional quality and depth. The Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company had its main offices in a building on Shawnee Avenue that was solidly built from brick and expressed, in its architecture, the company's belief in its own permanence. There were company houses, rows of identical wood-frame structures painted the same dull yellow, and company stores where miners bought their goods on company credit, and company churches where company-approved ministers led services on Sunday, and at the edge of all of it, the mines themselves, the tipples and head frames rising above the ridgelines like the bones of something enormous. He reported to the company's main office on his first Monday, and was received by F.P. Lewis, who was the company's operations manager for the Norton district, and who had the quality, Hensley wrote in his confession, of seeming to have been made from the same material as the mountains, dense and uncompromising, and not much interested in weather. Lewis was a large man, in his mid-40s, with a reddish complexion, and the careful, considered manner of someone who has learned that it is possible to accomplish a great deal through patience, and that it is rarely necessary to raise your voice. He showed Hensley the company clinic, which was better equipped than Hensley had expected. Lewis was proud of this, and explained that a sick or injured miner was a miner not working, and that there was therefore a clear economic logic to prompt and effective medical care. He explained Hensley's duties: daily sick call at the clinic from 7 until 9 in the morning, availability for mine emergencies at any hour, routine physicals for new employees, and documentation of all medical events in the company's records. Then Lewis had poured 2 glasses of bourbon. It was 10 in the morning, and sat back in his chair and said something that Hensley would write down that night in his personal journal and copy, years later, into his confession. "Doc," Lewis had said, "I want you to understand something about this work before you start it. These men, they break things, arms, legs, backs. Sometimes they die. You're here to fix the ones who can be fixed and to document the ones who can't. When you document, when you fill out the certificates, the reports, you're doing 2 jobs at once. You're doing the medical job, which is your business, and you're doing the legal job, which is the company's business. Those 2 jobs, most of the time, they're the same job. But not always. And when they're not the same job, I need you to understand which job you're working for. You understand me?" Hensley wrote that he had understood, in the abstract, had understood that Lewis was telling him that the company's legal interests would sometimes require accommodation in medical documentation, but he had not, that morning, understood what that accommodation would look like in practice. He was 26. He had been in the county for 4 days. He nodded and finished his bourbon and went to start his first sick call. The mines themselves he did not enter until his 3rd week. He went with a foreman named Caudill, a lean, weathered man from Dickinson County, who had been in the mines since he was 12, and who walked through the underground darkness with the ease of someone moving through a familiar room. The mine was a deep drift mine, an opening cut horizontally into the mountain rather than dug down from above, and the coal seam they were working was about 4 feet high, which meant that the men who worked it spent their shifts either crouching or lying on their sides, cutting coal from the face with picks and loading it into cars that mules or machines dragged to the surface. The air in the mine was not, Hensley thought, so different from air anywhere else at first, but as they moved deeper, he began to notice things. The way the dust hung in the lamplight in a kind of permanent suspension, moving slightly with the air currents from the ventilation shafts, but never really settling, never really clearing. The way it tasted, the way it coated the inside of his nostrils within minutes, and the sound was the thing he would never forget, he wrote. The sound of men breathing in that environment, the slightly thickened quality of it, the way even young men seemed to be working harder than they should have been just to pull air in and push it out. He had asked Caudill about the dust on the walk back to the surface. "Coal dust," Caudill said, "comes with the work." "Do many men develop respiratory complaints?" Hensley had asked, in the careful language of a young physician. Caudill had looked at him for a moment with an expression that Hensley described as not unkind, but comprehensive. The look of a man evaluating how much a new acquaintance is capable of understanding. "Doc," Caudill said, "you'll see." He saw. Within his first 2 months in Norton, Hensley had treated 11 miners for respiratory complaints, serious enough to bring them to the clinic. Most of them presented with what would have been, in a city practice, diagnosed as chronic bronchitis, persistent cough, thick sputum, shortness of breath on exertion that was, in several cases, severe enough to limit their ability to work. 3 of them had a more alarming presentation: a dense, progressive consolidation that showed up clearly on the X-ray equipment that was, somewhat to Hensley's surprise, available at the clinic, and that produced a pattern he recognized from his training as consistent with what had recently been described in the European medical literature as anthracosis, the blackening and hardening of lung tissue caused by long-term coal dust inhalation. The European literature on coal workers' lung disease was not extensive in 1907, but it was not absent either. Welsh and Scottish physicians had been writing about what they called miners' asthma for most of the 19th century. German researchers had described the pathological changes in miners' lungs in autopsy studies going back to the 1860s. A Scottish physician named Archibald McKellar had published a paper in 1874 describing what he called a distinct industrial pulmonary disease in coal miners that was neither tuberculosis nor ordinary bronchitis, but something specific to dust inhalation. None of this work had produced anything like a consensus in American medicine by 1907. The relationship between coal dust and lung disease was acknowledged in some quarters and dismissed in others. And in the coal fields of Appalachia, it was dismissed almost universally, both by company physicians who had the same incentive Hensley would shortly discover, and by a medical establishment that had not yet been confronted with the scale of the problem. But Hensley had read enough to know what he was looking at when he looked at those X-rays. He was looking at men whose lungs were being destroyed by their work. The first time he wrote those words on a death certificate, not those exact words, but the clinical equivalent, was in December of 1907, and the man whose death prompted it was named Elias Branham. Elias Branham was 44 years old and had been working in the Stoniga operations of the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company for 11 years. He had come originally from Letcher County, Kentucky, following the work west, and had settled in one of the company rows in the community of Stoniga with his wife Dora and their 4 children. He was, by all accounts, Hensley collected in the weeks after his death, a man of exceptional reliability and modest ambition. A man who wanted, above all things, to keep his family fed and housed, and who pursued that goal through the straightforward application of consistent, dangerous labor. He had worked the number 1 mine for most of his 11 years, and he had developed, over the last 3 of those years, the progressive respiratory disease that Hensley had been documenting in his clinical notes with increasing alarm. By the time Branham was brought to the clinic in the first week of December, brought because he could no longer walk the distance without stopping 3 or 4 times to lean against something and concentrate on the work of breathing, his lung disease was far advanced. Hensley examined him and recorded in his clinical notes: extreme dyspnea at rest, marked cyanosis of lips and fingernails, bilateral crackles throughout all lung fields. X-ray demonstrates extensive bilateral nodular opacification consistent with advanced coal workers' pneumoconiosis. Prognosis: weeks to months. He was correct about the timeline. Elias Branham died on December 19, 1907, in the company hospital, with his wife Dora at his bedside and 2 of his children waiting in the hall outside. He died of respiratory failure. His lungs had simply ceased to be capable of exchanging enough oxygen to sustain life. He had not been sick, not in the ordinary sense. He'd been slowly suffocated over 11 years by the material he had spent those years digging from the earth. Hensley sat down to complete the death certificate. He wrote, "Cause of death, pneumoconiosis, coal workers, type, secondary to prolonged occupational dust inhalation." He had finished writing the word inhalation when there was a knock at the door of the clinic office, and F.P. Lewis came in without waiting for an answer and looked at the certificate on the desk and sat down in the chair across from Hensley and said nothing for a moment in a way that contained more than silence usually does. "Branham," Lewis said. "Yes," Hensley said. Lewis looked at the certificate. He reached across the desk and turned it slightly so he could read it more clearly. He read it without expression. Then he set it back down and looked at Hensley. "Doc," he said, "we use pneumonia." Hensley said he did not understand, which was not entirely true, but was the thing you say when you are hoping you have misunderstood. "Pneumonia," Lewis said again. "That's what we put on these. Or tuberculosis, if it's been a long decline. Pneumonia comes from God. A man breathes bad air from God's atmosphere, and his lungs fail. That's a natural thing. No fault. No liability. No cause of action for the widow, and no finding by a compensation board." He paused. "The dust. If you put the dust on paper, you put the company on paper. You put the company in front of a judge. You put the company on the front page of the Norton Courier. You put a line through every death in the district for the last 20 years, and that line ends at a jury box. And that jury is full of men who used to work for us, or whose brothers do. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I believe I do," Hensley said. "Good," Lewis said. He stood up. He took the death certificate from the desk and held it out. Pneumonia. Acute lobar pneumonia. He'd been declining for some time, so perhaps pneumonia complicated by pre-existing pulmonary weakness. Something that sounds medical and final and unrelated to extraction. He paused again. "Dora Branham has 4 children, Doc. She gets a widow's payment if there's no finding of company liability. $200. That's not nothing. You fight this. There's a finding of liability. The company's lawyers come in, and she gets nothing, because the case goes on for years, and the company outlasts the lawyers, and outlasts Dora Branham, and those children go hungry in the meantime. You think about that." He left the certificate on the desk and walked out. Hensley sat for a long time. He looked at what he had written. He looked at the clinical notes, the X-ray results, the careful documentation of 11 years of a man being slowly destroyed. He picked up his pen. He wrote, in his confession 10 years later, about what it felt like. "I have tried many times to describe the sensation of crossing that particular line, and the best I can do is this. It felt like nothing. That is the most frightening thing I can tell you. I expected it to feel like something, like an act, like a decision, like a moral event with the appropriate weight. Instead, it felt like exhaling. I crossed out what I had written. I wrote, acute lobar pneumonia with contributing pulmonary weakness. I signed it. I put it in the outgoing documents tray. I went to the sink and washed my hands, which were not dirty, and went home to my company house and ate my company supper and slept in my company bed. The first death, not Branham's, mine. Dora Branham received her $200. She used it to move her children to Kingsport, Tennessee, where her sister lived. She was 29 years old and would live another 31 years, and she never remarried and never stopped believing. Her daughter would say this much later, in a newspaper interview in 1970, that her husband had been killed by the company, not by God. She was right. The pattern, once established, required remarkably little maintenance. That was the thing Hensley found most disturbing as the months became years and the years accumulated, not the individual acts of falsification, which never became easy exactly, but the ease with which a false act, performed consistently, becomes a procedure. There was no longer a moment of decision. There was only a form to fill, a cause to select from a small, approved vocabulary: pneumonia, tuberculosis, cardiac failure. The first two covered the respiratory deaths. The third covered the cases where the strain of compromised lungs had overloaded a heart that was working too hard for too long. All of them were, in their way, accurate descriptions of what had happened at the very end. All of them were, in the more important way, descriptions that concealed what had happened over the years before. In his confession, Hensley listed them all. The list occupies 11 pages of the original document, written in a smaller hand than the rest, as if he had been trying to fit more words into less space, as if the compression were itself a kind of acknowledgement of inadequacy. Patricia Hensley Kim, when she finally handed the document to Dr. James Tackett at the University of Virginia's College at Wise, told him that the list was the part she found hardest to read, not because of what it said, but because of how it was arranged. Each entry was in the same format: name, age, date, reported cause, actual diagnosis, years of service. The same format for all 123 names. The sameness of it. The first entries, from late 1907 and through 1908, show the careful notation of a man still in the early stages of a habit. The handwriting is a little heavier than the surrounding text, as if he were pressing down harder than necessary. The entries from 1910 onward are smaller, lighter, faster. By 1913, they have the quality of routine. But within the list, and more extensively in the narrative sections of the confession that surrounded it, Hensley had taken care to give individual accounting for specific men. He had done this, he wrote, because he understood that a list of names was not the same as a list of people, and that part of what made the falsification morally possible, what made it a procedure rather than a crime in the mind of the person committing it, was the transformation of individual men into entries, into cases, into items on a document that lived in a filing cabinet and was handled by people who had never known the men it named. He was not going to give the company that last reduction. Not in this document. Not if he could help it. James Calloway was 19 years old when he died, and he had been working in the mines for 3 years, and there was not a mark on him that you could see. He had come to work for the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company in the summer of 1909, 2 months after his 16th birthday, at a time when 16 was a legal working age in Virginia, and when the mines needed men badly enough that company recruiters occasionally looked the other way about ages that were clearly estimates. He came from a farm in Scott County, came with his older brother Thomas, who had been working the Stonega mines for a year already, and who had written home about the wages, which were real wages, cash wages, not the scrip that some companies paid but actual American dollars. Their father had a worn-out farm and 6 children, and a cough of his own that had been getting worse for 2 winters. And Thomas's wages had been making the difference between the family eating and not eating. And James had decided the summer he turned 16 that it was time to add his wages to Thomas's. He was a small young man. Hensley had done his entry physical and recorded his height as 5 feet 5 and his weight as 132 pounds, with the kind of wiry, economical build that mine work both selected for and consumed. He worked as a loader, which meant he spent his shifts shoveling the coal that the cutters had broken loose from the face into the cars that moved it to the surface, and it was work that required sustained physical output in a crouched position in an atmosphere that was, depending on the ventilation on any given day, somewhere between mildly and severely contaminated with coal dust. He developed a cough in the winter of his 2nd year. Not an unusual thing. Coughs went around the mine rows like weather, especially in winter, and most of them resolved in a few weeks. His didn't resolve. By the spring of 1910, it was productive. He was bringing up material, dark material, and when Hensley saw him at sick call in April, he noted in his clinical records what he saw: a young man with diminished breath, sounds in the lower lobes, bilaterally, a persistent, productive cough, and, on X-ray, the earliest suggestion of the nodular changes that Hensley had learned to recognize as the beginning of the coal worker's disease. He was 18 years old. Hensley wrote in his confession, "I told James Calloway that he had a chest cold that was resolving slowly, and that he should try to sleep with his head elevated and avoid damp air. I gave him a cough suppressant. I knew this was not a chest cold. I knew what I was looking at. I said nothing about the X-ray findings. I said nothing about the dust. I said nothing that would have been useful to him. Why? Because useful information would have been actionable information. If I had told James Calloway that the dust in the number 2 mine was destroying his lungs, James Calloway would have done one of 2 things. He would have left the mine, or he would have gone to someone, to a lawyer, to a reporter, to the Bureau of Mines when it opened the following year, and told them what the company doctor had said. Either action would have been rational. Either action would have cost the company something, a worker or a public finding of liability. My job was to prevent both outcomes, so I gave him a cough suppressant and sent him back to work. James Calloway died in November of 1910, 17 months after that sick call visit. He was 19 years old. His death certificate, signed by Dr. William Abner Hensley, lists the cause of death as acute pneumonia with pulmonary complications. His brother Thomas identified the body and wired their parents in Scott County. He did not, in the telegram, say what the death certificate said. He said, "James died of the mines." There was a man named Giacomo Ferretti who had come to Wise County from a village in the Calabrian region of southern Italy, in the province of Cosenza, in 1904, as part of the wave of southern European immigration that had been recruited, sometimes through labor agents who were not entirely honest about conditions, to fill the expanding coal operations in the Appalachian coal fields. He was 41 years old when Hensley first encountered him at a sick call in the spring of 1908, and he spoke limited English, enough to manage the basic transactions of mine work, the names of tools and commands, and the critical safety vocabulary, but not enough for a medical consultation of any depth. Hensley spoke no Italian. They managed, in the way of people who need to communicate and lack a common language, through gestures and through the particular physical vocabulary of a clinical examination. Hensley listened to Ferretti's chest and noted what he heard. He took a history as best he could, supplemented by the employment records that showed Ferretti had been in the Stonega mines for 4 years. He ordered an X-ray. The X-ray showed the middle stages of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, significant bilateral nodularity, some confluence, the beginning of the larger masses that would eventually dominate the picture and crowd out the functional tissue entirely. He sent Ferretti back to work with a bottle of expectorant and a note in his file. He did this knowing, he wrote, that Ferretti could not read the note, could not have accessed whatever was written in his file, and would not have been able to navigate the English language legal or medical system to act on any information. Hensley might have communicated to him, even if communication had been possible. Ferretti's isolation was linguistic as well as economic. He was doubly removed from the mechanisms of redress that were, in any case, inadequate, even for men who spoke the language and knew the system. Giacomo Ferretti died in January of 1912, at the age of 45, of what his death certificate describes as tubercular pneumonia. He left behind, in Italy, a wife and 3 children who received no communication from the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company about the circumstances of his death. Hensley does not know what happened to them. He writes about this gap in his knowledge with an agitation that breaks through the confession's otherwise controlled surface. I do not know what became of them. I do not know if they ever received word. I do not know if Giacomo Ferretti's family knows, 40 years later, how he died. These are things I cannot find out from here. This is a category of damage that I cannot even fully measure, much less repair. In the company records, the entry reads, colored male, age, approximately 45, number 4 mine, Stonega, cause, cardiac failure. There is a date, September 14th, 1911, and a signature, and that is all. No name. In the Bureau of Mines employment records for the same period, there is a payroll entry for the number 4 mine that lists only the designation used to indicate black workers in those records, a category marker rather than a name, with years of service recorded as 9 years. Hensley, in his confession, writes about this entry at length, longer than he writes about almost anyone else. The length is itself a form of acknowledgement of what the brevity means. I knew his name, Hensley writes. His name was Rutherford Hayes Addington, and he was given that name by his father, who had been born enslaved in Russell County and who had named his first freeborn son after the president who had been elected the year before that son's birth. In the particular way that newly free people sometimes claimed the names of public significance that had been unavailable to them. Rutherford Hayes Addington had worked the number 4 mine for 9 years and was, by the account of every man who worked beside him, one of the most skilled cutters in the operation, a man who could read a coal seam the way other men read text, who knew by touch and sound where the face would break and where it would hold, whose judgment about roof conditions had likely saved the lives of several men who worked near him. He died of his lungs. I knew this. I examined him. The findings were unambiguous. He was on his third visit to the clinic. The first 2 times he had been told, by me, that he had bronchitis and would benefit from rest, which he could not afford to take. And on this third visit, his breathing was labored at rest, and his color was wrong, and the sounds in his chest told me clearly what was happening. I wrote cardiac failure on his death certificate, because cardiac failure was, in a technical sense, the final event. His heart had been working against the resistance of destroyed lungs for so long that it failed. This was accurate in the way that saying a man who drowned died of drowning is accurate, technically true, and deeply false. His name does not appear in the main text of the death certificate. He is listed in the company records as colored male. He had a wife, Sadie, and 2 daughters, and they received no death payment because the company's compensation policy at that time did not cover black workers under the same terms as white workers. I have his name. I am writing it here. Rutherford Hayes Addington. He was 45 years old, and he was the best judge of a coalface in the Stonga district, and he is on the list I am writing, and his name will appear on it in full. And if anyone reads this in the future, I ask you to say his name out loud. Say it out loud, because it was never said correctly on any official document while he lived, and it was reduced to a category marker when he died. And every act of this nature, every reduction of a person to a notation, is its own kind of killing. I know something about that. There was a man named Samuel Price, who was 55 years old and had been in the coal mines of Southwest Virginia since he was 14, which meant he had been underground for 41 years. He had started as a trapper boy, a child who sat in the mine all day, opening and closing ventilation doors to allow the coal cars to pass, at a small operation in Buchanan County in 1870. A time when the great industrial transformation of Appalachian coal was still ahead, but already visible on the horizon, and he had worked his way through the various stages of mine labor over 4 decades. Trapper, driver boy, loader, cutter, fire boss, and finally to the position he held in 1911, which was section foreman at the No. 3 mine. A job that meant he was responsible for the safety and productivity of 23 men, and that required, above all, the particular expertise that only 40 years in the mines could produce. He came to Hensley's clinic not because he was sick, or rather not because he believed he was sick, but because he was required to have an annual physical examination as part of his supervisory position. He sat in the clinic examining room and answered Hensley's questions with the brisk, slightly impatient manner of a man who has a great deal to accomplish and considers medical examinations a minor obstacle in the way of accomplishing it. He coughed occasionally, a short, controlled cough that he clearly considered normal. And when Hensley asked him about the cough, he said he'd had it for years, that all the old-timers had it, that it was just the dust settling. The X-ray took the briskness out of him. Hensley set the film on the light box, and Samuel Price leaned forward and looked at it with the same attention he would have given to a roof map or a ventilation diagram. And then he sat back and was quiet for a moment. "That's not good," he said. "No," Hensley said. "How long?" Hensley looked at the film. The damage was extensive. The worst he had seen in a living patient, though he had by this point been in Norton long enough to see the pathology reports from autopsies that confirmed what the X-rays suggested. months to perhaps 2 years, he said. Depending. On what? On whether you continue to work in the mine. If you stop all dust exposure now. He paused. The damage that's done is done, but you might slow what comes next. Samuel Price looked at him. I've been in the mines for 41 years, Doc. My daddy died in the mines. My brother died in the mines. Every man I know died in the mines or will. What am I going to do? Go to the surface and do what? Hensley had no answer. He wanted to say, you could live longer. But longer at what, and at what cost, and by what means? Price had no savings outside of the company's store credit system. His house was a company house, his social world, his purpose, his identity. All of it was organized around the mines and the men who worked them. Telling him to leave the mine was like telling him to leave his life. I have to tell you something else, Price said. He was still looking at the light box, at the film. The ventilation in number 3. It's been worse this past year, since they extended the south heading. I've put in 3 requests for additional fans, and Lewis has sat on all 3 of them. The dust in there. It's worse than it's been. And the young men coming in now, some of them are coughing already in their 2nd year. Hensley wrote this down. He wrote it in his clinical notes, under the heading for Samuel Price's examination. He wrote it, and then he closed the notebook and went on with the examination. He did not send the notes to Lewis. He did not contact the Bureau of Mines, which had been established the previous year and had an inspector assigned to the region. He did not use what Samuel Price had told him in any official way. Samuel Price died on March 8, 1913, which was 6 months after that examination, and his death certificate lists the cause as pulmonary tuberculosis. Chronic. He had been in the mines for 42 years. The 42nd year was the one that killed him, or rather, the 42nd year was the year his body finally acknowledged what had been happening for most of the previous 41. Hensley had not been idle in the years of falsification. This is what makes the confession such an unusual document. Not merely that it is a record of wrongdoing, but that it is simultaneously a record of genuine scientific inquiry conducted in parallel with that wrongdoing, by the same man, in the same years, with the same patients. The moral structure of it is almost impossible to hold in mind at once. He was lying on the death certificates, and he was doing real science in secret. He was covering up the cause of death, and he was trying to develop treatments for the disease that was causing the deaths. He was, in other words, simultaneously making the problem worse and trying to solve it. And the reason he was doing both things at the same time was the same: his position within the company system. He began his research, he writes, in the spring of 1909, a year and a half after his first falsified death certificate. He had by that point signed 23 fraudulent certificates and was either managing to compartmentalize the ethical dimensions of this practice with considerable skill, or had found that the compartmentalization was becoming easier than he had expected. He does not distinguish between these possibilities in his confession, which is itself interesting. What he does say is that he was, as a physician, professionally dissatisfied. The medical situation he was observing was interesting. The pattern of respiratory disease in the mining population had features that the existing literature did not fully explain. The question of why some men progressed rapidly and others more slowly, given similar exposure times and working conditions, was genuinely unresolved. The question of whether any treatment could slow or halt the progression was genuinely open. He was a doctor. He was surrounded by a population with a specific disease. He was, he notes dryly in the confession, the only person in the county who both recognized the disease and had access to the patients. He began by doing what any researcher would do. He gathered data. He started a private journal, separate from his clinical records, kept in a locked drawer in his desk at home, in which he recorded the details of each respiratory case he saw: age, years of service, type of work, location within the mine, dietary habits, tobacco use, living conditions, rate of symptom progression. Within 18 months, he had observations on 64 patients, which was, he noted, a sample size that few clinicians in America at that time could have assembled on this particular disease. The patterns that emerged were partly expected and partly surprising. Expected. There was a clear correlation between years of service and severity of disease. Expected. Men who worked in the dustier parts of the mine progressed more rapidly. Surprising. There were significant differences in progression rates that could not be explained by exposure alone. Surprising. Men who ate diets rich in certain foods. He noticed particularly leafy vegetables and dairy products available in small quantities through the company store seemed to progress more slowly. Surprising. Men who had previously worked in well-ventilated portions of the mine and only later transferred to the dustier sections showed a different pattern of progression than men who had worked in high-dust areas from the beginning. The last observation suggested something that the existing literature had not addressed clearly: that the disease's progression might not be simply a function of total dust burden, but might depend on the rate of accumulation, that the body might have some capacity to manage slow, gradual exposure that was overwhelmed by rapid, intense exposure. This was not a trivial observation. If it were correct, it suggested that changes in ventilation, fans, improved air circulation, might meaningfully reduce the rate of disease progression even without eliminating dust entirely. He wrote up a preliminary analysis in 1910 and then locked it in the same drawer with his observations journal. He showed it to no one. The treatment research began in the winter of 1910 after Samuel Price's comment about the south-heading ventilation, but also after Hensley had read a paper published in a British medical journal about the use of medicated steam inhalation in industrial respiratory disease. The paper was not specifically about coal workers' pneumoconiosis. It concerned a ceramic industry, but the logic seemed transferable. The idea was that steam inhalation, particularly with agents that had demonstrated expectorant and anti-inflammatory properties, might help clear the airways and reduce the inflammatory response that drove the progression of tissue damage. He began experimenting with a preparation that combined steam, generated from a simple heated water vessel, inexpensive and widely replicable, with eucalyptus oil, which had well-established properties as a respiratory agent and which could be obtained cheaply. He added in some formulations small amounts of compound tincture of benzoin, which had been used for generations as a steam inhalation agent for respiratory conditions, and which he had evidence of therapeutic benefit in the European literature. The challenge was testing. He could not run a formal clinical trial. He had no way to run a formal clinical trial. He had no institutional affiliation outside the company, no access to independent funding, no means of publishing results without the company's knowledge, since any published work from a company physician would be seen as speaking for the company. And, more fundamentally, running a trial that demonstrated the effectiveness of a treatment for coal workers' lung disease would have required him to publicly name the disease. To name the treatment was to name the disease. To name the disease was to put the company on paper. He ran informal tests instead. He identified minors among his patients who were in the early stages of respiratory disease, detectable on X-ray, symptomatic but not yet severely compromised, and offered them, at sick call, a treatment he described as being for chest complaints. He set up steam inhalation equipment in a back room of the clinic and had willing patients come for sessions 3 times a week. He did not tell them what he was testing or why. He did not tell them what he suspected about their condition. He kept separate, private records of their symptoms and X-ray findings. Over 18 months, he treated 31 men with this protocol. The results were, and here the confession acquires an almost painful precision, as if Hensley is forcing himself to be exact about this particular thing, because imprecision would allow for the comfort of uncertainty. The results were clear. The men receiving treatment progressed more slowly, by a statistically evident margin, than the men I was following who were not receiving treatment. The symptom burden was measurably reduced in 19 of the 31 cases. In 4 cases, the rate of X-ray progression was dramatically slower than would have been predicted by their exposure history. In 2 cases, the progression appeared to have halted entirely over the 18-month observation period, though I was appropriately cautious about claiming too much from 2 cases over 1.5 years. The treatment was not a cure. I want to be clear about that. The fibrosis already established in the lung tissue did not reverse. The nodular changes that were already visible on X-ray did not disappear. But in men who were not yet severely compromised, consistent application of the steam inhalation protocol appeared to reduce the inflammatory component of the disease, slow the scarring, and maintain functional capacity that would otherwise have deteriorated more rapidly. It was, in short, a useful treatment, a meaningful treatment, a treatment that would have been cheap to implement broadly: water, steam, eucalyptus oil, and a few hours a week, and that might have meaningfully extended the working lives and the lives themselves of a significant number of the men in this district. I published nothing. I told no one. I locked the results in the drawer with the journals, and I continued the informal treatment of the 31 men in my trial, and I continued signing fraudulent death certificates, and I continued telling myself that these 2 activities were separate, when of course they were the same activity. They were both forms of knowing, and both forms of silence. The Bureau of Mines investigator arrived in the spring of 1912. His name was Henderson. Hensley does not record a first name, and he was a compact, precise man from Washington who wore a suit that was somewhat too warm for the Virginia spring, and who carried a leather satchel that appeared to contain nothing but documents and a systematic skepticism about everything he was told. He had been sent to the Stonega district as part of the Bureau's first round of inspections following its establishment in 1910, a process that was already revealing troubling patterns in mining mortality across the Appalachian coal fields, and that was generating significant pressure in Washington from labor organizations and from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Henderson met with Lewis first, for what Hensley gathered was a lengthy and professionally cordial conversation in which Lewis provided production statistics, safety records, and documentation of the company's various welfare programs, the housing, the clinic, the company school for minors' children, and presented a picture of an operation that took its responsibilities to its workers seriously. Then Henderson met with Hensley. They sat in Hensley's office at the clinic, and Henderson asked questions, and Hensley answered them, and the confession's account of this interview is among the most painful passages in the document. Not because Henderson was aggressive or accusatory, he was neither. He was systematic and open and appeared, Hensley wrote, to be genuinely trying to understand what he was looking at. He asked about respiratory disease rates. He asked about causes of death in the mining population. He asked whether Hensley had observed patterns in the clinical presentation of respiratory complaints that differed from what he would have expected in a general population. He asked me, in essence, whether coal dust was killing these men. Hensley writes, "He asked me this in terms that were medically specific, enough to make clear that he understood the question. He was not an ignorant man. He had done his reading. He had perhaps already spoken to physicians in other districts. He was giving me the opportunity to confirm what he suspected. I told him that the mortality patterns in the district were consistent with those in comparable populations elsewhere in the region, which was technically true in the sense that every comparable district had the same falsified records. I told him that the respiratory disease I observed was generally attributable to the normal range of infectious illness that affected working populations in this climate, which was a lie. I told him that the company's ventilation practices were adequate to the scale of operations, which was a lie I had no direct evidence to support, but offered anyway. He listened to all of this. He wrote things in a notebook. He thanked me for my time. At the door, he turned back. He said, "Doctor, I want to ask you one more question, and I want you to understand that I'm asking it as one professional to another, not as part of any official record." He paused. "If you had a relative, a brother, say, who was thinking of coming to work in these mines, would you advise him to come?" I looked at him. He looked at me. We both knew what the question meant. "The work is dangerous," I said. "All mine work is dangerous, but the company maintains its operations to industry standard." He nodded. He put on his hat. He left. Lies, when practiced daily, become easier than the truth. I had been lying for 4.5 years. I had said true things so infrequently in the official contexts that mattered that I had lost the facility for them in those contexts. The lie came first now. The truth required an effort, the lie did not. That is the real disease, not the coal dust, not the fibrosis. The real disease is what it does to the person who covers it up. It remakes the pathways. It changes what is natural. I had become, without planning to, a man for whom a certain kind of dishonesty was the path of least resistance, and I had become this man while simultaneously documenting the dishonesty in private journals that no one would read. I had become very good at two things that were impossible to reconcile, and I had found a way to practice both of them in the same life. And I had told myself that the journals made the difference. that the act of private documentation was not nothing, was in fact something. And I am here to tell you that this is not true. Private documentation of wrongdoing is not the same thing as resistance to wrongdoing. I know that now. I wish I had known it then. Henderson's report on the Stonega district, when it was published in 1912, noted that respiratory disease rates in the Southwest Virginia coalfields were elevated relative to the general population and recommended improved ventilation practices, but drew no conclusions about occupational causation for the specific disease pattern Hensley was observing. The language was careful, and the conclusions were limited. It was the language of a man who had not been given what he needed to say, what he suspected. There was a woman in the Stonega Rows named Celia Mead. She was 43 years old in 1912 and had been a widow for 4 years, since her husband, Harlan, died in the spring of 1908 of what his death certificate called acute pneumonia. And she ran the household by taking in laundry and by keeping a garden that was, by all accounts, extraordinarily productive for a company row garden. And she had a quality that the other women in the rows both admired and found faintly alarming. She remembered everything, not in the showy way of someone who makes a display of remembering, but in the quiet, comprehensive way of someone who has decided that the act of remembering is a form of duty. She had started, sometime in 1909, keeping a notebook. It was a simple composition book, the kind children used for schoolwork, and she recorded in it the details of every death in the Stonega mining community that she learned of or witnessed or heard secondhand. Not just the deaths of miners, though those were most of the entries. The death of a child, the death of an elderly woman, the death of a man in the mine from a roof fall, as well as the slow deaths, the coughing deaths, the deaths that came after years of decline, that everyone in the rows understood, and that the death certificates did not describe. She was not a physician. She had no medical training. She was recording what she saw and heard, and was told by the women who knew her and trusted her, which was most of the women in the rows. She recorded names and ages and the circumstances of dying as she understood them, and next to many of the entries, the ones where the death had come after the characteristic pattern of progressive respiratory decline. She wrote, in a column she headed simply what they said, a summary of what the family had been told by the company doctor. Doctor said pneumonia. Doctor said tuberculosis. Doctor said heart. She knew something was wrong. She did not know exactly what or how large the wrong was, or what the medical terminology for it might be. She knew what she saw. She knew what the women told her. She knew that men who had worked the mines for 10 or 15 years developed a cough that got worse and never got better, and eventually killed them, and that the death certificates said things that did not match what she had watched happen, and that the company doctor was the person who wrote the death certificates. She had been thinking about this for 3 years when she came to the clinic. She came on a Tuesday morning in October of 1912, after the last patient at sick call had left. She was not sick. She sat down across from Hensley without being invited to, and put her composition book on the desk, and folded her hands on top of it, and looked at him. "Mrs. Mead," Hensley said. He was aware, he wrote, of a particular quality of attention in the room, the attention of someone who has decided to say something difficult and has prepared for it. "Doctor," she said, I've been keeping account of the deaths in this camp since my husband died. I don't know what's on those certificates. I don't have access to those, but I know what killed these men, and I know it's not what gets written down, and I think you know it too." Hensley said nothing. "I'm not here to make trouble for you," she said. "I don't have the means to make the kind of trouble I'd need to make, and I know it. I'm here because I think you're a person who knows the truth, and I wanted to say the truth out loud to someone who knows it, because I'm tired of being the only person in a room who will say it out loud." He looked at the composition book on the desk. She did not offer it to him. "How many names?" he said. "In my book? 43? Since 1907. Men who died the way my husband died, after the same kind of decline." He was quiet. The clinic was quiet. Outside, on the road through the rows, a mule cart went past, the iron-rimmed wheels on the packed earth making the sound that he would always associate with that moment. A sound like something being measured out in even quantities. "I know what's in my book," she said. "I don't know what's in yours, but I think we both know that they should say the same thing." He had no answer for that. He had, in the 4.5 years since Elias Branham's death, given a great many answers to a great many questions, and had become proficient in the art of answering in ways that technically addressed what had been asked while concealing what he knew. But Celia Mead had not asked him a question. She had made a statement. She had said the truth out loud to someone who knew it, and the effect of this was something he had not anticipated. "She left after perhaps 15 minutes, he wrote. "She did not threaten me. She did not ask me to do anything. She did not offer her book to me, or ask to see my records. She said what she'd come to say, and she stood up, and she put her book under her arm, and she left. I sat at my desk for a long time after she went. I want to say that this was the moment when I decided to write the confession. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think the confession had been forming for years, the way certain geological formations form, slowly and invisibly, before they are visible on the surface. But Celia Mead's visit was the moment I became fully conscious of what I had been forming. She said the truth out loud to someone who knew it. The effect of this, I cannot overstate the effect of this. There is something that happens when a person says a true thing directly to someone who knows it to be true and has been pretending otherwise. It's not accusation. It's not confrontation. It's something more quietly devastating than either. It's the removal of the last available pretense that no one knows. That night, he went home to his company house, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he took out the private journals, and he read what he had written over 5 years of secret observation. He read the treatment research. He read the list of falsified names. He read his own account of Henderson's visit and the lies he had told. He read all of it in order, from the beginning, which he had not done before. He had added to the journals, but had not gone back and read them as a continuous document. He began to write. The writing of the confession took 2 weeks in April of 1914. He wrote every night after dark, sitting at the kitchen table with his medical journals and his private observations notebooks open beside him, composing a document that was simultaneously a legal record, a medical record, a personal testimony, and something he did not have a precise word for. Something in the territory between a will and an apology, and a scientific paper, with elements of all three and the full character of none. He was 43 years old. He had been in Wise County for 7 years. He had falsified, by the count he made that April, 123 death certificates. He had conducted research that he believed could meaningfully reduce the toll of coal workers' lung disease. He had done neither of the things a person in his position could have done. He had not refused the falsification and accepted the consequences, and he had not published the research. He had, instead, kept records. He had documented everything: the names, the dates, the diagnoses, the company directives, the instructions from Lewis, the treatment results, the research methodology. He had kept these records in private journals that no one could read because he had never shown them to anyone. The records were, in some sense, the most rigorous possible documentation of his own failure to do what the records documented. He had decided, some years earlier, that this was not enough. He had decided that the documentation needed to become a confession, a document meant not for a private drawer, but for eventual public reading. The question had been when, not now. Lewis was alive. The company was operational. The legal exposure was severe, and Hensley could not see a path from disclosure to justice that did not run through his own professional and legal destruction, through years of litigation that the company would outlast, through outcomes that were too uncertain to justify the near certainty of personal devastation. Later, then. But how much later? He had thought about this question carefully. He was not a young man anymore, but he was not old. He might live another 20 or 30 years. Lewis might live that long. The company would certainly outlast both of them. The families of the miners he had failed were alive now, the widows, the children. In 20 years, if he lived that long, some of them would still be alive. They would be capable of suing the company, capable of reopening compensation claims, capable of being hurt again by a disclosure that reopened old wounds without providing adequate redress. The timing needed to balance disclosure with the practical ability to use the disclosure. He had thought about what the confession was for. It was not primarily for revenge or for judgment. It was for history, for the historical record, for the permanent naming of what had happened. And it was for science. The treatment research was valuable, and the medical data about exposure and progression was valuable, and both could help people who had no connection to these particular mines in these particular mountains. The scientific value of the information did not expire. The historical value did not expire. The legal value might, through statutes of limitation, but that was perhaps not the most important consideration. He settled on 100 years, 100 years from his death. He was 43, and in reasonable health, and expected to live perhaps another 30 years, which would put the opening date somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, far enough from living memory of the company's power and the miners' families' vulnerability, far enough for the historical record to have stabilized and for the falsifications to be clearly documentable against other records. He wrote the instruction on the outside of the envelope. Not less than 100 years after the date of my death. He sealed the document with wax. He pressed his medical school ring into the wax while it was still soft. The ring from UVA's medical school, 1906, the year he had graduated believing that medicine was a calling. He locked the envelope in the cedar chest that had come with him from Roanoke and put the cedar chest in the attic of his company house. And then, thinking better of it, moved it to his own mother's house in Roanoke when he visited that Christmas, knowing that his mother would keep it without opening it, knowing that company property could be accessed by the company, and that his mother's attic was more reliably private than anything that belonged to the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company. He died 3 years later, not of lung disease. The irony of this did not escape him, or at least it did not escape the confession, which notes it. I am not dying of the disease I documented. I am dying of what appears to be cancer of the stomach, which has no connection to the mines or to coal, or to the things I covered up. I will not die of the dust. This seems, in some accounting systems I have tried to construct, like either a mercy or an injustice, and I cannot decide which. He died on March 3rd, 1917. He was 45 years old. The First World War was consuming Europe. The Bureau of Mines was still attempting to document the respiratory mortality rates in the Appalachian coal fields with the inadequate data available to it. The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act was 52 years in the future. The mine rows in Stonega were still full of men, coughing in the coal dust dark. The cedar chest traveled from his mother's attic to his wife's house after his mother died, and then to his daughter's house, and then to his granddaughter's, and then to his great-granddaughter's basement in Norton, where it sat until Patricia Hensley Kim sat down on that basement floor on the 14th of June, 2017, and held a yellowed manila envelope sealed with wax, and began to understand that it was not, as the family had always assumed, a will or a love letter. Dr. James Tackett at UVA's college at Wise received Patricia's voicemail on the morning of June 15th, 2017, and called her back that afternoon, and drove to Norton the following day. He sat at Patricia's kitchen table and read the document over the course of 6 hours, stopping periodically to take notes and to ask Patricia questions about the family history and the cedar chest's provenance. He was, by his own account later, not a man easily shaken. He had been studying labor history in the Southwest Virginia coal fields for 20 years. He had read the company archives at the University of Virginia. He had read the Bureau of Mines reports from the 1910s and 1920s. He understood the system that Hensley was describing, understood it structurally, academically, in the way that historians understand systems they have studied but not lived within. What he was not prepared for was the names. He knew the death records. He had spent years with the death records for Wise County from 1905 to 1920, had used them in his research on mortality patterns in the coal industry, had noted the elevated rates of pneumonia and tuberculosis in the mining population, while also noting, with the careful hedging of a historian working with limited data, that these records might not fully capture the true cause pattern. He had suspected falsification. He had written, in his most recent book, that the death certification practices of company physicians in the Stonega district during the period 1905 to 1920 merit further scrutiny and may represent a systematic undercount of occupational disease mortality. Now he had the physician's own testimony, with names, dates, and specific diagnoses, organized in a table that occupied 11 pages of the confession. He spent the next 3 days cross-referencing the names in Hensley's list against the death records for Wise County, the census records for 1910 and 1920, the payroll records in the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company archives at UVA, and the employment records that the Bureau of Mines had compiled during its 1910s inspections. 118 of the 123 names in Hensley's list were verifiable against at least 2 independent sources. The dates matched, the mine assignments matched, the ages matched. In 34 cases, the symptoms described in Hensley's private clinical notes, which were among the supporting documents in the confession, were consistent with what family members had described in oral history interviews that Tackett had conducted over his years of research. "It's real," he wrote in his own notes from those 3 days. "All of it. Every name is a real person. Every date is accurate. The diagnoses, both the official false ones and the private true ones, are consistent with the medical picture and with what we know about the disease progression." Hensley was a meticulous record keeper. He documented his own crime with the same care he would have given to a scientific study, which, in a way, it was. He contacted Dr. Sarah Chen at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, who had published extensively on the history of occupational lung disease, and who had a particular interest in the period before federal coal mine health regulation. Chen flew to Charlottesville on a Saturday, drove to Tackett's office, and read the confession. She then read the treatment research. Her reaction to the treatment research was, by multiple accounts, more emotionally charged than her reaction to the list of falsified deaths, which she described as horrifying, but historically unsurprising, a documentation of what we have long suspected. The treatment research was different. She went through Hensley's methodology carefully, checking it against modern understanding of coal workers' pneumoconiosis and its mechanisms. The protocol, steam inhalation with eucalyptus oil and compound tincture of benzoin, administered 3 times weekly, combined with the dietary observations and the ventilation data, was, she said, remarkably sophisticated for 1911. More than sophisticated. It anticipates approaches that were independently developed in the 1940s and became standard practice by the 1960s. His hypothesis about the inflammatory component was correct. His observation about exposure rate versus exposure burden was correct and remained underappreciated in the literature for decades. If this had been published, if he had published the 1912 results, it would not have cured anyone already sick, but it would have established at a national level that coal workers' lung disease was a real and distinct entity, that it was caused by coal dust, and that there were effective mitigation strategies. That finding would have been extremely difficult to continue denying. The timeline of federal regulation might have been significantly different. How significantly is impossible to say precisely, but meaningfully different. She paused. Then she said, "He had this in 1912. He treated 31 men. He knew it worked. And he said nothing." The exhibit opened at the Wise County Historical Society in October of 2018, 15 months after Patricia Hensley Kim had sat on that basement floor with a yellowed envelope in her hands. It was not a large exhibit. 3 glass cases and a wall of mounted documents and photographs, plus a label printed on heavy paper that read, "The Hensley Confession, A company doctor's record of industrial disease in the Stonga district, 1907 to 1914. The document itself, in a preservation case in the center case, had been digitized and deposited at the University of Virginia libraries and at the National Archives. A summary prepared by Tackett and Chen had been published in the journal Labor History and had generated coverage in regional newspapers and in a long piece in the Atlantic that was widely shared. The second glass case contained something that had not been part of the original opening of Patricia's cedar chest and had not been part of the original exhibit planning. It had been found separately by a researcher at the Southwest Virginia Cultural Center and Museum in Big Stone Gap, who had been recataloguing a box of donated materials from the early 1970s, a box of miscellaneous items from the Stonga community that had been donated by a woman whose mother had lived in the mine rows and that had never been fully inventoried. The box contained several items of minor historical interest and one item of major interest, a composition book, water-stained and missing its back cover, filled with handwriting that the researcher recognized after an hour of close reading as a record of deaths in the Stonega community from approximately 1908 to 1915. It was Celia Mead's notebook. The researcher had contacted Tackett, who had driven to Big Stone Gap the same afternoon, and read the notebook from cover to cover in the museum's reading room. He had then sat very still for a while. The notebook contained 71 entries. 43 of them overlapped, in name or date or both, with the names on Hensley's list. 28 were deaths that Hensley had not listed. Deaths from other causes, deaths before the period Hensley had tracked, deaths of women and children. The 43 overlapping entries were for men whose deaths Celia Mead had recorded in her column, headed what they said with notations like, "Doctor said pneumonia / had the long cough for 4 years, and doctor said his heart, coughed all last winter, all this spring, and tuberculosis on the paper. Miner's cough was what we called it." She had not known what the medical terminology was. She had not known what was on the death certificates. She had known what she saw and heard, and she had written it down. And she had kept the composition book for 40-odd years and given it to her daughter, who had eventually included it in a box of community materials donated to a museum where it had sat in an uninventoried box for 40 years until a researcher opened it and began to read. 2 people on opposite sides of the company line had documented the same crime from entirely different positions. One had the medical degrees and the clinical records and the authority and had used all of it to commit the crime and then record his commission of it in secret. One had no credentials and no authority and no access to the official records and had simply written down what the women in the rows knew. The official record said pneumonia. The community record said the long cough, the miner's cough, the cough that came with the work and didn't leave until the man was in the ground. Both records, read together, said the same thing. They said, these men were killed by coal dust, and the people who knew this said nothing for 100 years. Tackett presented the 2 documents side by side at the exhibit, Hensley's confession under glass and a reproduction of Celia Mead's notebook on the wall beside it. He titled the wall panel, 2 Records of the Same Truth. In his catalog essay for the exhibit, he wrote about what it meant that these 2 documents had survived independently, had been kept by 2 people who met once, in a clinic in 1912, and had been found separately, decades apart. He wrote about what it said about the kinds of knowledge that survive and the kinds that are lost, about who gets to write history and who keeps their own account in a composition book that might have been thrown away or rained on or burned. He wrote, Hensley had every institutional advantage and used none of it for justice. Meade had no institutional advantages and kept the record anyway. The confession is more famous because it came from a doctor and was sealed with wax. The notebook is more important because it shows that the knowledge existed at every level of this community all along, that no one was deceived who did not choose to be deceived, and that the women in those rows were not confused about what was happening to their husbands and fathers and brothers. They knew. They wrote it down. They passed it on. On a Thursday morning in November of 2018, a man named William Addington came to the Wise County Historical Society with his wife and his daughter, who was 11 years old. He was 72 years old, a retired coal miner himself, third generation, and he had read about the Hensley exhibit in the Coalfield Progress newspaper and had driven over from Stonega, which was technically still an address in Wise County, though much changed from the company town era. He had grown up hearing his family talk about his grandfather, who had died in 1911 when William's father was 6 years old, and about whom the family had only the most fragmentary information, partly because 6-year-old children do not retain reliable biographical detail, and partly because the community culture around industrial death in that era did not encourage extensive public discussion, and partly because the death certificates had cardiac failure and offered no further narrative. He stood in front of the exhibit for a long time. His wife stood beside him. His daughter read the wall panels with the careful attention of a child who has been told that this is important. He found the name in the second glass case in the photographic reproduction of Hensley's list. The entry, Addington Rutherford Hayes, age 45. Number 4, mine, Stonega. Date, September 14th, 1911. Reported cause, cardiac failure. Actual diagnosis, advanced coal workers' pneumoconiosis with cor pulmonale. And then, in the separate section of the confession where Hensley had written about individual cases, the paragraph that ended. His name was Rutherford Hayes Addington. Say it out loud. William Addington stood in front of that case for a long time. His daughter came and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. After a while, she said, "Granddad's granddad?" "My grandfather," he said. "My dad's father." She read the entry. She was 11 years old, and she read it with the thoroughness of an 11-year-old encountering something that is being given weight by an adult she trusts. It says his real cause was coal dust. "Yes," he said. "But the certificate said his heart." "Yes." She thought about this. Then she said, "We always wondered why his death certificate said tuberculosis." This was a verbatim repetition of something William had said in the car on the drive over. A thing he'd said out loud while thinking about how to explain to his daughter why they were going to see this exhibit. And she had absorbed it and was now saying it back to him in the present tense of the document in front of her, the way children do when they are trying to make sure they understand correctly. He put his hand on her shoulder. He looked at the name. He said it out loud. Rutherford Hayes Addington. He said it in the museum room in Norton, Virginia, in November of 2018, 107 years after the death, and 34 years after the falsification of the death certificate had been by the operation of a sealed envelope and 100-year silence, waiting to be corrected. The history of black lung denial in the American coal industry extends far beyond Wise County, Virginia, and far beyond the Stonga operations of the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company. It is a history that runs from the first serious medical observations of the disease in the mid-19th century to the passage of the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act in 1969, which was itself preceded by a wildcat strike of 40,000 West Virginia miners who shut down the coal fields in protest of the state legislature's failure to pass adequate black lung compensation legislation. The act, when it passed, was the first federal law to require that coal mine operators control the levels of coal dust in their mines, and the first to provide federal compensation benefits for miners disabled by black lung disease. It was 62 years late, by the most conservative accounting of when the medical evidence was sufficient to support the necessary policy conclusions. Hensley's confession sits within this larger history as a particularly clear specimen of a mechanism that operated throughout that history. The company physician who understood what he was seeing and did not say what he knew. Not all company physicians were as actively complicit as Hensley was. Some certified honestly and were dismissed or pressured into retirement. Some navigated toward compromise positions that acknowledged the disease without naming its cause in the specific, actionable terms that would have generated legal liability. But the company physician who falsified or hedged or omitted was common enough that the pattern was structural, not individual. It was a feature of the system, not a deviation from it. The company physician who told the truth was the exception who was removed from the system. The company physician who accommodated the company's interests was the rule who was sustained within it. Hensley was neither the worst of them, nor, in the final accounting, the most characteristic of them. He was unusual in the degree and the duration of his private documentation. He was ordinary in everything else. The treatment research is perhaps the most difficult part of the confession to hold in view, not because it is the most dramatic. The list of falsified names is more stark, more immediately human, more directly enraging. But the treatment research is the part that most clearly defines the particular shape of Hensley's failure. He was not merely a man who lied on documents. He was a man who lied on documents while possessing information that could have saved lives, and who chose, in a choice that was also partly a non-choice, a default into the path of least resistance, to keep that information locked in a drawer. The steam inhalation treatment with eucalyptus and compound tincture of benzoin was, as Sarah Chen noted, independently developed in the 1940s. It became a component of standard occupational respiratory care by the early 1960s. The specific combination and protocol that Hensley used was not published until his confession made it available, which means that the 50-year gap between his results and their independent rediscovery is genuinely attributable to his silence. Whether earlier publication would have changed outcomes significantly is a question that cannot be answered with precision. But the question can be asked, and the asking of it has a weight that does not go away. One word, not even a word, a choice of word. Pneumoconiosis instead of pneumonia. The specific cause instead of the convenient approximation. One word on one death certificate in December of 1907 would not, by itself, have changed the course of industrial history in the Appalachian coalfields. But it would have been a different kind of act than what Hensley did. It would have been the beginning of a different kind of record, one that said, in the language of official documentation, what the women in the mine rows already knew. Instead, acute lobar pneumonia with contributing pulmonary weakness, 123 more of the same, 100 years of silence. Reverend Amos Tolliver had been the pastor of the Stonga Baptist Church from 1905 to 1928, a tenure that encompassed the entire period of Hensley's work in the district, and he appears in the confession in 3 places. He appears first in 1908, conducting the funeral of Elias Branham. Hensley attended, which he describes as one of the stranger experiences of that strange first year, sitting in the back pew of a church, while a man whose death certificate he had just falsified was eulogized with the honesty that the certificate had refused. He appears second in 1912 in a brief reference to a conversation Hensley describes having with Tolliver about the mortality patterns in the community, a conversation in which Tolliver said, with a pastoral directness that Hensley seems to have found both admirable and uncomfortable. "The men are dying of the work, doctor, not of pneumonia and not of tuberculosis, but of the work. I don't have your medical knowledge, but I have 20 funerals a year for men who died the way miners die, and I know the difference between that and an epidemic." Hensley records that he deflected this observation with the same careful non-answers he had used with Henderson from the Bureau of Mines. He appears third in the closing pages of the confession, in a passage that is among the most personal in the document. "I thought about Reverend Tolliver often in those 2 weeks of writing. I thought about the funerals. I attended a great many of them. The funerals of men on the list I am compiling, men whose deaths I certified with the company's approved vocabulary, and then whose services I attended in Tolliver's church, where Tolliver said the words that the church has always said over the dead, and then added, because he was that kind of man, specific things about specific lives, the particular quality of this man's work, the specific love he had for his children, the way he walked or spoke or laughed. Tolliver never said the word murder at a funeral. He never said company. He gave the dead their individuality back for an hour in a church, and then everyone went back to the rows and the mines. I think he knew what I was. I think he knew the way Celia Mead knew, not with documents, but with the knowledge that comes from being present and paying attention and refusing to look away. I wonder sometimes what he thought about me in the years after. I wonder if he is still alive. He would be old now, 70-something, if he has survived, and if he has pieced together the shape of what happened here. I wonder if he would say that I am beyond forgiveness or within its reach. I am not writing this for forgiveness. I said that at the beginning. I say it again here, not to be emphatic about it, but to remind myself. The impulse, when writing something like this, is to move toward absolution, to arrange the facts so that they tell a story in which the author is tragic rather than merely guilty, in which the circumstances overwhelm the choice, in which the system is the villain and the man within the system is its victim as much as its instrument. I've tried to resist this impulse and I have not always succeeded. There are places in this document where I can feel myself reaching for sympathy I have not earned. I ask the reader to notice those places and to discount them appropriately. What I'm writing for, what I think I am writing for, is precision. I want the record to be precise. I want the names to be right, and the dates to be right, and the medical findings to be accurately stated. I want the treatment results to be in a form that someone with medical training can evaluate and, if they find them useful, act on. I want the system I was part of to be visible in enough detail that its mechanisms are legible. Not because I think this document will change the system, which has its own momentum and its own interests, and will not be changed by one doctor's private confession, however carefully composed, but because I believe there is value in precision, even when precision cannot produce justice. There is value in saying, this happened in this way to these people, for these reasons, and these are their names. The names are what matters. Everything else I have written here is context for the names. There are things that the Hensley Confession did and things it could not do. It could not return Dora Branham's $200 to the level of compensation her husband's death should have generated. It could not return to James Calloway's parents the child they sent to the mines and did not get back. It could not locate the wife and 3 children of Giacomo Ferretti in a Calabrian village and tell them what had become of the man who went to America and never came home with more than his wages, and then stopped coming home entirely. It could not give Rutherford Hayes Addington a death certificate that said his name in full and named his actual cause of death. It could not do these things because it came too late. This is what Hensley understood when he set the 100-year delay. He understood that the document's power to produce particular forms of justice was limited by timing, and that timing was something he could control, and that the choice to delay was therefore also the choice to accept that certain forms of justice were simply foreclosed. He sealed the envelope and put it in the cedar chest and accepted, or tried to accept, that the particular justice of a wronged man receiving acknowledgement from the person who wronged him, the live, present justice of confrontation and accounting, was not available, and that he was choosing something else instead, the cold, durable justice of the historical record. Whether this was a reasonable exchange is a question that does not have a single answer. It is the question that Tackett and Chen and Patricia Hensley Kim have all been asked in the years since the exhibit opened, and all of them have answered it differently in different contexts and with different emphases. The most frequent thing said by the family members of miners, whose names appear on the list, when interviewed by journalists or documentary filmmakers or historians, is some variation of, "I'm glad we know. I always knew there was something." The second most frequent thing is, "Why did he wait?" The third most frequent thing, from the family members who are older, who are the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the men on the list, rather than the great-great-grandchildren, is a silence that is itself a kind of answer. The silence of people who have lived a long time with a wrongness they couldn't name, and who are now being offered the naming at a point in their lives where naming and justice are very different things. Patricia Hensley Kim has said, in the various interviews she has given about the confession, that she found it difficult to hold her feelings about her ancestor steady. "He was not a good man," she said in one interview, in the sense that he made bad choices and people died partly because of those choices, and he was not a bad man in the sense of being a person without conscience or without remorse. He was a man who made a series of choices over a period of years, and then spent the rest of his life documenting his own failure to make better ones. I don't know what to call that. I don't have the word for it. The word might be complicity, not the theatrical kind that appears in stories about obviously evil systems with obviously evil participants. The quieter kind. The kind that happens when a person of ordinary conscience is placed within an unjust system and begins, through increments too small to feel like decisions, to accommodate the system's requirements. The kind that happens daily, in forms both larger and smaller than Hensley's, in workplaces and institutions and communities everywhere. The kind that is interesting precisely because it does not require a villain, does not require a person who wanted to hurt anyone, does not require cruelty or malice or exceptional moral failure. The kind that requires only a person who wanted, more than other things, to keep his position, and who found, year by year, that keeping his position cost a little more than it had the year before, and who paid what it cost, and who wrote it all down. The mine rows are gone. The company houses are gone. The Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company was absorbed through a series of mergers and acquisitions in the 1920s, and no longer exists as a distinct entity. F.P. Lewis died in 1929, 12 years after Hensley, having outlasted the company physician who had served his interests and managed his risk. The Bureau of Mines continued its incomplete work for decades. The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act finally passed in 1969 after the Farmington mine disaster in West Virginia killed 78 men, and after those 40,000 miners walked off the job in protest of the failure to legislate. Black lung compensation has been a contested, imperfectly funded program ever since, with periodic crises in the trust fund that pays benefits, with ongoing litigation about the standards of proof required to receive those benefits, with a resurgence of black lung cases in recent decades as mining methods changed in ways that increased silica dust exposure. The disease is not history. The mechanisms that Hensley served, the institutional pressures that make it easier for a person with medical knowledge to keep quiet than to speak, are not history either. The cedar chest sits now in Patricia Hensley Kim's living room in Charlottesville. The confession is at the National Archives. The names are on a database maintained by the UVA College at Wise that is accessible to family members who want to search for relatives. Celia Mead's notebook is in a preservation case at the Southwest Virginia Cultural Center and Museum in Big Stone Gap. Hensley's eucalyptus steam inhalation protocol, his exact formulation, documented in the supporting materials of the confession, was evaluated by a team of pulmonologists at the UVA Medical Center in 2018. They confirmed what Sarah Chen had found, that the formulation was consistent with current understanding of the anti-inflammatory mechanisms involved in coal workers' pneumoconiosis, and that its systematic application in a high-exposure population could meaningfully slow disease progression. The team published a brief letter in the New England Journal of Medicine, noting the historical priority of the treatment and citing its source. The citation reads, Hensley, W.A. Treatment Protocol for Coal Workers' Respiratory Disease, unpublished, 1911 to 1913. Sealed Confession, opened 2017. William Abner Hensley Papers, National Archives. He published in the end, not in his lifetime, not in any form he would have recognized as publication, not soon enough to save any of the men he treated in secret or any of the men he documented in private journals. But the work is there now, named, attributed, assessed. The 31 men he treated secretly in that back room of the company clinic, who were told they were receiving treatment for chest complaints, and who were not told what he knew about their condition, received a treatment that was real and effective, and that the medical establishment reached independently a generation later. He knew it in 1912. He locked it in a drawer, one word on a death certificate, in December of 1907. 123 more certificates in the years that followed. 2 weeks of nighttime writing in April of 1914 at a kitchen table in a company house in Stonega, Virginia, with a lamp and a locked drawer full of documentation and the knowledge that he was writing something that would outlast him by a century, and that would arrive, eventually, in the hands of someone capable of understanding it and doing something with the understanding. 100 years of silence. And then, Patricia Hensley Kim on a basement floor, a yellowed envelope in her hands, the smell of coal coming from a cedar chest that had traveled through 4 generations, and the first words of a man who had been waiting across 100 years to say what he knew. I write this not to be forgiven, but to be understood. Whether he is understood, whether understanding of this particular kind is meaningful, is worth 100 years of waiting, is adequate to the scale of what was done, is a question that each reader must answer for themselves. The names are in the record. The dates are accurate. The treatment worked. Rutherford Hayes Addington was 45 years old and the best judge of a coal face in the Stonega district, and his name is said out loud now, 107 years after his death, in a county that still carries coal in its history, the way the men who worked those mines carried it in their lungs. The dust doesn't leave. It accumulates. It changes the tissue. But the names, the true names, the names that the certificates refused, those can be said. Those can be written. Those can be given back. That is what William Abner Hensley was doing in a company house in April of 1914 at the kitchen table by lamplight, while the mine rows slept around him and the mountains held their coal in the dark. He was giving back the names. The Virginia Iron, Coal and Coke Company operated in Wise County, Virginia, from the late 19th century through the 1920s. The Bureau of Mines was established in 1910. The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act was passed in 1969. Black lung disease, coal workers' pneumoconiosis, continues to affect miners across the Appalachian coal fields, with a resurgence of cases documented by researchers in the 2000s and 2000s. The Black Lung Compensation Trust Fund has faced multiple funding crises. The names of the men who died of the disease their death certificates would not name are, in most cases, still only in the communities that knew them.